James Mitchell stood quietly in the corner of the Grand Palace ballroom, watching every movement around him. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd of diplomats and dignitaries who had gathered for the special evening event. For 15 long years, he had served as one of the most trusted royal guards in the British Royal Family Protection Team. His job was simple but crucial: keep the royal family safe from any threat that might come their way. The tall man with broad shoulders had seen it all during his time at the palace. He had protected royalty during state visits to dangerous countries. He had stopped suspicious individuals from getting too close to the royal family members. He had even saved a young prince from a falling chandelier during a ceremony 3 years ago. James was not just any ordinary guard. He was a former military officer who had received special training in emergency medicine and combat techniques. His background made him different from other guards. While most security personnel only knew basic protection methods, James had completed advanced courses in first aid and life-saving procedures. The royal family trusted him completely because he had proven himself time and again. Whether it was a medical emergency or a security threat, James always knew exactly what to do and how to do it quickly. The mission that brought him to New York had been particularly challenging. A member of the royal family had been visiting the United Nations for important diplomatic meetings. The security concerns were higher than usual because of recent global tensions. James had spent 3 weeks planning every detail of the protection strategy. He had worked 18-hour days ensuring that every possible risk was identified and managed properly. During those weeks in New York, James had barely slept. He had coordinated with American security agencies, checked and double-checked all the venues, and planned escape routes for every possible scenario. The responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders because he knew that one small mistake could have serious consequences. The royal family member he was protecting had several important meetings with world leaders, and each meeting required different security arrangements. The mission had gone perfectly without any incidents or problems. James had successfully completed another assignment, and the royal family member had returned to England safely. Now it was time for James to return home to London. He had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. After the stress and pressure of the New York assignment, he needed to rest and recover. James had booked himself a business-class seat on the flight back to London. It was not a luxury for him, but a necessity. His large frame needed the extra space and comfort after weeks of sleeping in uncomfortable hotel rooms and working long hours without proper rest. He had paid the full price for the premium seat using his own money because he believed he deserved some comfort after his dedicated service. At John F. Kennedy Airport, James arrived 2 hours early, as was his habit. He always planned ahead and never left anything to chance. He wore civilian clothes instead of his usual uniform, but anyone who looked closely could see the unmistakable posture of a trained professional. His back was straight, his movements were precise, and his eyes constantly observed his surroundings, even when he was off duty. James carried a small leather bag with his essential items and important documents. Inside the bag were his credentials, his passport, and a few personal items that he always kept with him during travels. He also had a small medical kit that he never traveled without. It contained basic emergency supplies that had proven useful on several occasions during his years of service. The airport was busy with travelers from all over the world. James found a quiet corner near his gate and sat down to wait for his flight. He was tired but alert as always. His mind was already thinking about returning to his normal duties at the palace. He had no idea that this flight would become one of the most important moments of his entire career. James walked confidently toward the boarding gate with his business class ticket in hand. He had been looking forward to the comfortable seat and proper meal service that would help him recover from his exhausting weeks in New York. The gate area was crowded with passengers waiting to board the flight to London. James found the business class boarding line and stood patiently behind a few other premium passengers. When his turn came, James handed his boarding pass to the female gate agent with a polite smile. She was a middle-aged woman with blonde hair pulled back tightly and a name tag that read Sarah. She took his ticket and scanned it with her electronic device. Suddenly, her expression changed, and she frowned as she looked at her computer screen. Sarah looked up at James with an annoyed expression on her face. She did not seem pleased about something, and James could sense that there might be a problem. He waited patiently as she typed something on her keyboard and then looked at the screen again. Other passengers in line behind him were getting restless, and James could feel their eyes on him. Finally, Sarah spoke in a cold and dismissive tone. "Your business class seat has been given to someone else," she said without any apology in her voice. "We had to accommodate a more important passenger who needed that particular seat." James was shocked by her words and the rude way she delivered them. He had paid full price for his ticket and had confirmed his reservation multiple times. James remained calm despite his growing frustration. He asked politely if there might be another business class seat available on the flight, or if the airline could arrange alternative accommodations. Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically, as if his request was completely unreasonable. She acted like James was bothering her with his presence at the gate. "There are no other business class seats available," Sarah replied in an even ruder tone. "You should be grateful that we are not bumping you from the flight completely." She then slid a new boarding pass across the counter toward James. The new ticket showed seat 47B, which was located in the very back of the economy section between two other passengers. James picked up the new boarding pass and examined it carefully. He realized that he was being moved from a comfortable business class seat that he had paid for to a cramped middle seat in the worst part of the airplane. The injustice of the situation was clear, but James maintained his professional composure despite feeling angry and humiliated. Other passengers who were waiting in line had heard the entire conversation. Some of them looked at James with sympathy, while others seemed to enjoy watching someone else get treated badly by the airline staff. James could see that a few airline employees near the gate were whispering to each other and occasionally glancing in his direction with smirks on their faces. James asked Sarah about compensation for being downgraded from the premium seat that he had purchased. She laughed coldly and told him that he would receive a small voucher that could be used for future travel. The amount she mentioned was only a fraction of the price difference between business class and economy class. It was clear that the airline had no intention of treating him fairly. Despite the unfair treatment, James accepted the situation with dignity. He thanked Sarah politely, even though she had shown him no respect or courtesy. James gathered his leather bag and walked toward the economy class boarding line. He could hear some of the airline staff making quiet comments about the nobody they had just downgraded. As James stood in the much longer economy line, he reflected on the strange situation. Here he was a man who spent his days protecting royalty and ensuring their comfort and safety, being treated like he was worthless by an airline that knew nothing about who he was or what he did for a living. James made his way down the narrow aisle of the airplane toward his assigned seat in the back of the economy section. The plane was completely full, and passengers were struggling to fit their carry-on bags into the overhead compartments. James had to wait several times as people blocked the aisle while trying to organize their belongings and get settled into their seats. When he finally reached row 47, James discovered just how bad his situation really was. Seat 47B was squeezed between two other passengers in the very last row of the airplane. On his left side in seat 47A was a young mother holding a crying baby who looked like he would not stop fussing during the long flight to London. The baby was already red-faced and screaming loudly despite the flight not even taking off yet. On James' right side in seat 47C was a very large man who took up most of his own seat and part of James' seat as well. The man was wearing a tight-fitting shirt, and his arms and shoulders spilled over into the middle seat area. James realized that he would have to spend the next 8 hours pressed against this stranger with barely enough room to move his arms or legs. James tried to squeeze into his assigned seat, but there was hardly any space left for him. His broad shoulders and tall frame were completely unsuited for the cramped conditions. The seat was designed for someone much smaller, and James felt like he was being compressed into a tiny box. His knees pressed against the seat in front of him, and his elbows had nowhere to go without bumping into his fellow passengers. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but James could barely see them from his position in the back corner of the plane. He noticed that the same crew members who had witnessed his humiliating downgrade at the gate were now working on the flight. They seemed to recognize him, and James caught them glancing in his direction with the same smug expressions they had worn earlier. When James pressed the call button to request a glass of water, one of the flight attendants took several minutes to respond. When she finally came to his seat, she acted annoyed that he had bothered her. She brought him a small plastic cup with barely any water in it and set it down roughly on his tray table without saying a word. Throughout the first hour of the flight, James tried to get comfortable, but it was impossible in the tight space. The crying baby next to him had not stopped screaming, and the large passenger on his other side kept shifting in his seat and bumping into James with his elbow. James felt like he was trapped in the worst possible conditions for what would be a very long flight. The flight attendants continued to provide James with the bare minimum of service. When mealtime came, they served the other passengers in his row first, and then seemed to forget about him entirely. James had to remind them twice that he had not received his meal tray. When it finally arrived, the food was cold and unappetizing. James watched as the same flight attendants who were ignoring him provided excellent service to the passengers in business class and first class. They were smiling and attentive to those passengers, while treating James like he was invisible or unworthy of basic courtesy. The contrast was obvious and painful to witness. As the plane reached its cruising altitude, James tried to close his eyes and rest. He drew on his military training to remain calm and composed despite the uncomfortable situation and poor treatment. He had endured much worse conditions during his military service, and he told himself that he could handle a few hours of discomfort. But something felt different about this flight. James had developed strong instincts during his years of protecting the royal family, and those instincts were telling him that something was not quite right. He could not identify exactly what was bothering him, but he felt a sense of unease that went beyond his personal discomfort. The turbulence that had started as minor bumps was becoming more noticeable. James felt the airplane shaking more than usual, and he noticed that some of the other passengers were beginning to look worried. His trained eye observed everything around him, even while he tried to rest in his cramped and uncomfortable seat. 3 hours into the flight, James was trying to doze despite the uncomfortable conditions when a sudden commotion erupted several rows ahead of him. A woman started screaming in panic, and her voice cut through the steady hum of the airplane engines. James immediately opened his eyes and sat up straight as his protective instincts kicked in automatically. The screaming woman was pointing at the man sitting next to her in the window seat. James could see that something was seriously wrong with the passenger, who appeared to be unconscious and slumped over in his seat. The man was a well-dressed businessman who looked to be in his late 40s, with graying hair and an expensive suit that was now wrinkled from his collapsed position. James watched as the man's face began turning a frightening shade of blue, which he recognized immediately as a sign of oxygen deprivation. The unconscious passenger was not breathing normally, and his body had gone completely limp. His wife, who was sitting next to him, continued screaming for help as she tried to shake him awake, but got no response from her husband. Flight attendants rushed toward the medical emergency from different parts of the cabin. James could see the panic in their faces as they realized they were dealing with a life-threatening situation at 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. The crew members had received basic first aid training, but nothing had prepared them for this kind of serious medical crisis. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Lisa, tried to assess the situation, but it was clear that she was out of her depth. She checked for a pulse on the man's wrist and neck, but James could see from his seat that she was not finding what she was looking for. The unconscious passenger showed no signs of breathing, and his skin color was getting worse by the second. Panic began spreading through the surrounding passengers as they realized someone was dying just a few feet away from them. Children started crying, and adults were whispering nervously about what might happen. The confined space of the airplane cabin made everyone feel trapped with a medical emergency, and there was nowhere for anyone to go. Lisa grabbed the intercom microphone and made an urgent announcement that echoed throughout the entire aircraft. "Is there a doctor on board?" she asked in a shaky voice. We have a medical emergency and need immediate assistance from any medical professionals who might be traveling with us today." She repeated the announcement twice, but no one responded or came forward to help. James knew from his medical training that time was running out fast for the unconscious passenger. When the brain is deprived of oxygen for more than 4 minutes, permanent damage begins to occur. After 6 to 8 minutes without oxygen, the chances of survival drop dramatically and brain death becomes likely. Every second that passed without proper medical intervention decreased the man's chances of survival. The flight crew tried everything they could think of, but their limited training was not enough for this serious situation. They attempted to wake the passenger by speaking loudly to him and gently shaking his shoulders, but he remained completely unresponsive. They tried to position him better in his seat, but his body was dead weight and difficult to move in the cramped airplane environment. James watched as precious minutes ticked away while the crew fumbled with their basic first aid procedures. He could see that the unconscious man's condition was getting worse and that the flight attendants were running out of ideas. The man's wife was becoming more hysterical as she realized that her husband might be dying and that no one seemed able to help him. The other passengers were starting to panic as well. Some people were crying while others were praying quietly. A few passengers had gotten out of their seats to see what was happening, but the flight attendants told them to sit down and stay out of the way. The cabin was filled with tension and fear as everyone realized they were witnessing a life or death situation. James felt his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. His years of training and experience told him exactly what needed to be done, but he was stuck in his cramped seat in the back of the plane. The same airline staff who had treated him so poorly were now facing an emergency that required exactly the kind of skills and training that James possessed. James could not sit still any longer while watching a man die in front of him. Without hesitation, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up from his cramped seat in the back of the airplane. The large passenger next to him looked surprised as James squeezed past him and stepped into the narrow aisle. James began pushing his way forward through the crowded cabin toward the medical emergency. Other passengers moved aside as they saw the determined look on James' face and the confident way he carried himself. His military training was evident in every step as he navigated through the tight space between the airplane seats. People could sense that this was someone who knew what he was doing and was not going to let anything stop him from reaching the unconscious passenger. When James reached the scene of the emergency, he spoke in a clear and authoritative voice that cut through all the panic and confusion. "I am trained in advanced CPR and emergency medicine," he announced firmly to the flight attendants who were still struggling with the situation. The crew members looked up at him with surprise and relief as they realized that help had finally arrived. James immediately took control of the medical emergency with the professional confidence that came from years of training and experience. He had dealt with life-threatening situations many times during his military service and his work protecting the royal family. This was exactly the kind of crisis that his specialized training had prepared him to handle. The flight attendants who had treated James so rudely earlier in the flight now stared at him in shock and amazement. They could hardly believe that the passenger they had downgraded and dismissed was now taking charge of a life-or-death situation. The same man they had treated like he was nobody was clearly someone very special with skills they desperately needed. James quickly knelt down in the narrow aisle next to the unconscious passenger and began his medical assessment. He checked for breathing by looking for chest movement and listening for air sounds, but found neither. He then felt for a pulse on the man's neck using the proper technique he had learned in his advanced medical training, but could not detect any heartbeat. The diagnosis was clear to James immediately. The passenger was in cardiac arrest, which meant his heart had stopped beating and was no longer pumping blood to his brain and other vital organs. Without immediate intervention, the man would die within minutes. James knew that CPR needed to be started right away to have any chance of saving the patient's life. James looked up at the flight attendants and gave them clear instructions in a calm but urgent voice. "I need you to call the cockpit and have them contact medical support on the ground," he said. "Also bring me the automatic defibrillator from the medical kit and clear this area of unnecessary people. The crew members jumped to follow his orders without question. James then turned to the unconscious man's wife, who was still crying and trying to wake her husband. "Ma'am, I need you to move to a different seat so I can work on your husband," he said gently but firmly. "I am going to do everything possible to save his life, but I need space to perform CPR properly." The woman reluctantly moved to an empty seat across the aisle. James positioned himself properly next to the patient and placed his hands in the correct position on the man's chest. He had performed CPR many times during training exercises and a few real emergencies, but never at 30,000 feet in the cramped confines of an airplane cabin. The narrow aisle and tight seating made everything more difficult, but James adapted quickly to the challenging conditions. Before starting chest compressions, James checked one more time for any signs of breathing or pulse. Finding none, he knew that immediate action was required. He looked around at the anxious faces of the passengers and crew members who were watching him intently. Everyone was depending on him to save this man's life, and James felt the weight of that responsibility. James began chest compressions using the precise technique he had learned and practiced countless times. He pushed hard and fast on the center of the patient's chest, counting out loud to maintain the proper rhythm. The cramped airplane environment made his work more difficult, but James focused completely on the life-saving procedure that could mean the difference between life and death for the unconscious passenger. James began performing chest compressions with the steady rhythm and precise technique that could save the unconscious man's life. He pushed down hard on the center of the patient's chest and then released completely before pushing down again. The compressions needed to be at least 2 inches deep to effectively pump blood through the man's body and keep his vital organs alive. 1, 2, 3, 4, James counted out loud as he worked. His voice was steady and calm despite the life or death situation, unfolding at 30,000 feet above the ocean. The airplane was shaking with turbulence, but James maintained his focus and continued the chest compressions without missing a beat. Nothing could distract him from the critical task of keeping blood flowing to the patient's brain. Sweat began forming on James' forehead as he worked continuously to restart the man's heart. The physical effort required for effective CPR was enormous, and James could feel his arms and shoulders beginning to burn from the repetitive motions. But he had trained for situations exactly like this, and his military conditioning helped him push through the growing fatigue in his muscles. The narrow airplane aisle made everything more challenging for James. He had to work in a cramped space with passengers' seats on both sides, limiting his movement. The turbulence caused the plane to shake and bump, making it harder to maintain steady compressions. But James adapted to the difficult conditions and continued working with unwavering determination to save the patient's life. Flight attendant Lisa brought the automatic defibrillator from the airplane's medical kit, as James had requested. He glanced at the device and quickly determined that it was not yet needed, since he wanted to try manual CPR first. The defibrillator would only be helpful if the patient's heart was beating in an abnormal rhythm, but right now there was no heartbeat at all. James continued the chest compressions while giving instructions to the flight crew. He told them to contact the cockpit and have the pilot's radio for medical advice from ground-based emergency physicians. He also asked them to prepare oxygen equipment in case the patient regained consciousness. The crew members followed his directions without question, since they could see he knew exactly what he was doing. The unconscious man's wife watched anxiously from her seat across the aisle. She was crying softly and praying as James worked to save her husband's life. Other passengers had formed a protective circle around the medical emergency, giving James space to work while also showing their support. Some people were recording the dramatic scene with their phones, while others simply watched in amazed silence. Minutes passed as James maintained the steady rhythm of chest compressions. 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes. He knew that every second was critical and that brain damage could occur if oxygen did not reach the patient's brain soon. But James never stopped working and never showed any sign of giving up on the unconscious man. The physical strain was becoming intense for James. His arms ached from the constant compressions and sweat was dripping down his face, but his military training had taught him to push through pain and exhaustion when lives were at stake. He had protected members of the royal family through dangerous situations, and now he was using those same skills to protect a complete stranger. 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes. James continued counting and compressing as the airplane shook around him. The other passengers watched in complete silence as this ordinary-looking man in civilian clothes fought against death itself. No one knew that James was a royal guard, but everyone could see that he was someone very special with extraordinary skills. The flight attendants who had treated James so poorly at the beginning of the flight now looked at him with growing respect and admiration. They realized they had completely misjudged this passenger who was now trying to save someone's life. The same man they had downgraded and dismissed was proving to be a hero when it mattered most. 11 minutes, 12 minutes. James began to worry that his efforts might be too late. CPR could only sustain life for so long without the heart actually beating on its own. But he refused to give up and continued the life-saving compressions with the same steady rhythm he had maintained since the emergency began. The unconscious patient was depending on him, and James would not let him down. Just as James was beginning to worry that 12 minutes of CPR might not be enough, the unconscious patient suddenly gasped loudly. The sound cut through the quiet airplane cabin like a gunshot, and everyone froze in amazement. James immediately stopped his chest compressions and watched carefully as the man's chest began rising and falling on its own for the first time since the emergency had started. The patient's eyes fluttered open slowly, and he looked around in confusion, trying to understand what had happened to him. His face, which had been blue and lifeless just moments before, was now returning to a normal, healthy color. James quickly checked for a pulse on the man's neck and found a strong, steady heartbeat that filled him with relief and satisfaction. A spontaneous cheer erupted throughout the entire airplane cabin as passengers realized they had just witnessed a genuine miracle. People who had been holding their breath for the past 12 minutes suddenly burst into applause and celebration. The sound was deafening in the confined space as everyone expressed their joy and amazement at what they had just seen. James remained focused on his patient, even as the celebration continued around him. He carefully monitored the man's vital signs to make sure he remained stable after his cardiac arrest. James checked his breathing, his pulse, and his level of consciousness while asking simple questions to assess whether there had been any brain damage from the lack of oxygen. The saved patient's wife rushed from her seat across the aisle and knelt down next to her husband. She was crying tears of joy as she grabbed his hand and spoke to him softly. Her husband squeezed her hand back and tried to speak, but James gently told him to rest and save his energy. The emotional reunion was beautiful to witness after the terrifying moments when it seemed like the man might die. James helped the patient sit up slowly and made sure he was comfortable and breathing easily. The man was weak and confused, but he was alive and conscious, which was more than anyone had dared to hope for just minutes earlier. James continued to monitor him closely, watching for any signs that his condition might worsen again. The flight attendants who had treated James with such contempt earlier in the flight now looked at him with newfound respect and gratitude. They realized they had witnessed something extraordinary, and that this passenger they had dismissed was actually a trained professional who had just saved someone's life. Their attitude toward James changed completely in that moment. Lisa, the head flight attendant, approached James with tears in her eyes. She thanked him repeatedly for his quick thinking and skillful actions that had saved the passenger's life. She apologized for the way the crew had treated him earlier and admitted that they had made a terrible mistake in judging him. James accepted her apology graciously without any hint of anger or resentment. Other passengers began approaching James to thank him and express their admiration for what he had accomplished. Many people told him that they had never seen anything so brave and impressive in their entire lives. James remained humble and modest about his actions, explaining that he had simply done what his training had taught him to do in an emergency situation. The saved passenger was now fully conscious and able to speak in a weak but clear voice. He looked up at James with gratitude and emotion as he realized that this stranger had literally brought him back from the dead. He tried to thank James but became too emotional to speak properly. His wife thanked James over and over again, saying that he had given her back her husband and saved their family. James coordinated with the flight crew to contact ground-based medical personnel who could provide additional guidance for caring for the patient during the remainder of the flight. The doctors on the ground confirmed that James had performed textbook-perfect CPR and that his quick actions had prevented permanent brain damage that would have occurred if the cardiac arrest had lasted much longer. The atmosphere in the airplane cabin had been completely transformed from panic and fear to celebration and gratitude. Passengers who had been strangers just hours before now felt connected by the shared experience of witnessing a life being saved. Everyone was talking about the incredible rescue and praising the mysterious hero who had stepped forward when he was needed most. James continued to stay close to his patient for the remainder of the flight, making sure he remained stable and comfortable. The man recovered steadily and was able to sit up and talk normally as they prepared for landing in London. James had not only saved his life, but had done so in a way that prevented any lasting damage from the medical emergency. As news of the dramatic rescue spread throughout the airplane cabin, passengers began sharing the incredible story on their social media accounts. People were posting videos and photos of James performing CPR and praising the humble hero who had saved a life at 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. The story was already beginning to go viral on the internet before the plane had even landed in London. Several passengers who had recorded the emergency on their phones approached James to ask for permission to share the videos online. They wanted the world to see what an amazing thing he had accomplished and how his quick thinking and medical skills had prevented a tragedy. James was hesitant about the publicity, but agreed that the story might inspire others to learn CPR and emergency medical techniques. Flight attendant Lisa quietly spoke with other crew members about James' background and learned from the passenger manifest that he worked for the British Royal Family Protection Services. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt as she understood that they had downgraded and mistreated someone who spent his professional life protecting the most important people in the country. Lisa felt sick to her stomach as she thought about how badly the airline staff had treated James at the gate and during the flight. They had judged him based on his appearance and assumed he was nobody important. Now she realized they had been dealing with a highly trained professional who possessed exactly the kind of skills that had just saved a passenger's life. The captain of the aircraft personally left the cockpit to visit James and thank him for his heroic actions during the medical emergency. Captain Wilson was a veteran pilot with 30 years of flying experience, and he had never seen anything quite like what James had accomplished. He shook James' hand firmly and told him that his actions had prevented what could have been a terrible tragedy. Captain Wilson offered James any available first-class seat for the remainder of the flight as a gesture of appreciation for his life-saving efforts. James politely declined the offer, explaining that he preferred to stay near his patient to monitor his condition until they landed safely in London. The captain was impressed by James' continued dedication to the man he had saved. Passengers throughout the airplane began approaching James to express their gratitude and admiration for what he had done. Many people told him that they felt honored to have witnessed such an act of heroism and that they would never forget what they had seen. Parents pointed James out to their children as an example of how one person can make a difference when they have the courage to act. An elderly woman from first class made her way back to economy class specifically to thank James for his actions. She told him that watching him save the passenger's life had restored her faith in humanity and proved that there were still good people in the world who would help others without expecting anything in return. Her words moved James deeply, even though he remained modest about his accomplishments. The saved passenger was now sitting up comfortably and talking with his wife about what had happened to him. He had no memory of collapsing or being unconscious, but he understood that James had performed CPR for 12 minutes to keep him alive. The man was overwhelmed with gratitude and kept trying to find words to properly thank the person who had saved his life. James learned that the passenger he had saved was named Robert Thompson and that he was a businessman returning home to London after a successful trip to New York. Robert had no history of heart problems, and the cardiac arrest had been completely unexpected. Doctors would later determine that he had suffered from a rare but treatable heart rhythm disorder that could be managed with medication. The flight crew realized they had learned a valuable lesson about treating all passengers with respect and dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived status. They had made assumptions about James that were completely wrong and had nearly missed the opportunity to have a true hero on their flight when he was desperately needed. Lisa approached James again to apologize more formally for the way he had been treated by the airline staff. She promised that she would report the incident to her supervisors and recommend changes in how the airline trained its employees to interact with passengers. James accepted her apology graciously and told her that the important thing was that everyone had learned something valuable from the experience. Other crew members also came forward to thank James and apologize for their earlier behavior. They admitted that they had misjudged him completely and that his actions had taught them an important lesson about not making assumptions about people based on first impressions. The airline staff would never again treat a passenger the way they had treated James at the beginning of the flight. When the airplane touched down safely at London Heathrow Airport, emergency medical personnel were already waiting on the tarmac to transport Robert Thompson to the hospital for further evaluation and treatment. James had coordinated with ground medical services during the flight to ensure that proper care would be available immediately upon landing. The paramedics boarded the plane quickly and professionally took over Robert's care. The emergency medical team was amazed when they learned that James had performed CPR for 12 minutes and successfully revived a patient who had been in cardiac arrest. The paramedic supervisor told James that his quick actions and proper technique had undoubtedly saved Robert's life and prevented permanent brain damage. Without James' intervention, Robert would certainly have died during the flight. As Robert was being prepared for transport to the hospital, he grabbed James' hand one final time to thank him for giving him back his life. Robert's wife was crying tears of gratitude as she hugged James and told him that their family would be forever grateful for what he had done. She promised that they would find a way to properly honor him for his heroic actions. The story of James' heroic rescue had already begun spreading rapidly across social media platforms around the world. Passengers who had witnessed the emergency were sharing videos and photos of James performing CPR with captions praising the mysterious hero who had saved a life. The hashtag #SavedAt30,000 feet was trending on multiple social media sites within hours of the flight landing. Major news outlets quickly picked up the viral story and began reporting on the dramatic mid-flight rescue. Television news programs showed the passenger videos of James performing CPR while praising his quick thinking and medical expertise. Reporters tried to identify the hero, but James had quietly left the airport before they could interview him about his actions. The story generated widespread criticism of the airline company for their poor treatment of James before he became a hero. Social media users expressed outrage that the airline had downgraded and disrespected someone who later saved a passenger's life. Many people called for policy changes regarding how airlines treat their customers and demanded better training for airline employees. James returned to his duties at the Royal Palace quietly and without fanfare, as was his nature. He did not seek publicity or recognition for what he had done, but simply went back to his normal responsibilities, protecting members of the British royal family. His supervisors at the palace learned about his heroic actions from news reports and commended him for upholding the highest standards of service and dedication. Robert Thompson made a full recovery in the hospital, where doctors confirmed that James' quick actions had prevented any permanent damage from the cardiac arrest. Robert's family was so grateful that they established a scholarship fund in James' honor to provide emergency medical training for security professionals and first responders. The scholarship would help others learn the life-saving skills that James had used to save Robert's life. The airline company eventually issued a public apology for their treatment of James and announced new training programs for their employees, emphasizing the importance of treating all passengers with respect and dignity. The company also implemented new policies to prevent passengers from being downgraded unfairly and established procedures for better recognizing and accommodating passengers with special qualifications or needs. James' story inspired thousands of people around the world to learn CPR and basic emergency medical techniques. Training organizations reported a significant increase in enrollment for first aid and CPR courses as people realized how important these skills could be in saving lives. James had not only saved one man's life, but had also motivated many others to prepare themselves to help in emergency situations. The viral video of James performing CPR became one of the most shared and viewed rescue videos in internet history. People around the world were moved by the sight of one person stepping forward to save another's life without regard for recognition or reward. The story became a symbol of human compassion and the difference that one person can make when they have the courage and skills to act. James continued his quiet service to the royal family, knowing that he had made a difference in the world that extended far beyond his normal duties. He had shown that true heroism comes not from seeking glory, but from being prepared to help others when the moment demands it. The flight that began with humiliation and poor treatment had ended with James proving that dignity, character, and service are more important than any first-class seat or special treatment. Robert's family kept in touch with James and considered him part of their extended family. Every year on the anniversary of the rescue, they would meet to celebrate the gift of life that James had given them. The story of the Royal Guard who saved a life at 30,000 feet became a lasting reminder that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places and that one person's actions can change everything.